It was an ordinary evening. Nothing special, and Alice and I decided to spend it at a cozy bar we had visited many times before. The bar was small, with soft lighting and low music. The locals knew each other, and in general, the atmosphere here was always calm and relaxing. No noise, no fuss, perfect for having a quiet chat, sipping a cup of coffee or a glass of wine. Alice and I often met here just to talk about life, about relaxation, about what was on our minds. But today, something was off. From the very beginning, the atmosphere changed as soon as we met Richard. Alice introduced him as an old acquaintance she hadn't seen in years. He was one of those people she had once been close with, but for some reason, their paths had diverged, and they no longer kept in touch. We exchanged greetings, but I immediately felt that something about his behavior was strange. Richard was fairly tall, with a light stubble and a rather self-assured look. He smiled, but something about his smile didn't seem sincere. His eyes, when he looked at Alice, seemed too intense, as if he forgot that there were other people around. He immediately started talking to her as if no time had passed, as if they had just met yesterday. Alice was wearing a dark blue dress with a deep neckline that highlighted her slim figure. I noticed how Richard, without any shame, couldn't take his eyes off her. He was clearly enjoying her attention, and it was obvious that his interest in her had long moved beyond mere friendship. Alice noticed it almost immediately. Her face flushed slightly, and she instinctively straightened her posture, but I saw how her hand trembled slightly when she adjusted her dress. I could feel the tension building between us, a tension that was hard to ignore. I looked at Alice, trying to understand how she was perceiving what was happening. She didn't say a word, but her body was giving away her feelings, tense muscles, a slight attempt at a closed gesture. She wasn't used to such attention. Not from Richard, not from anyone. When Richard stepped away for a couple of minutes, Alice suggested we change seats. I agreed, though deep down I doubted it would help. We moved to a corner, to a more secluded spot, but in my heart, I knew that just changing places wouldn't solve the problem. We couldn't escape his gaze. Richard, it seemed, didn't even notice. He continued radiating confidence and attention, not hiding his desire. When he returned, he brought 3 glasses of drinks, trying to create an atmosphere of good old times, and proposed a toast to memories, but his gaze, once again focused on Alice, left no doubt. I noticed how she could no longer look him in the eye, her responses becoming short, distant. Her whole body was telling me she wanted to leave, but she stayed put, as if trying not to show that she was uncomfortable. I tried to keep the conversation going, but Richard increasingly ignored me, as though I wasn't even there. His friends, sitting at a nearby table, started glancing our way, exchanging looks, and I realized they were noticing everything. They were clearly discussing what had just happened and weren't even trying to hide their smirks. I felt something boiling inside me. These people, Richard, seemed to be looking at Alice like an object for their amusement. And it hurt to realize that, watching her suffer, trying to maintain an outward calm while clearly not feeling comfortable, was painful. I realized that I couldn't just stand by. When we left the bar, I saw the color drain from Alice's face. She was shaken, but tried to hide it. I suggested we find somewhere quieter to talk, and we went to a nearby cafe. But despite the change of scenery, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much more serious was happening. Richard was not just someone who enjoyed light games. He clearly wanted something more, and it was becoming clearer to me that his intentions went far beyond a casual encounter. I began to worry about how far he was willing to go, and what would happen if I just let things be. But deep down, I knew I couldn't leave Alice in this situation. I had to do something. Not for me, but for her. When we decided to leave the bar, the atmosphere around us was heavy, and I felt as though the invisible wall between us and the world outside was becoming thicker. Alice was the first to stand up, her movements quick and slightly nervous. She didn't say a word, but I saw how her fingers tightly gripped her purse, as if she was trying to hold herself together. I followed her, feeling every second as the tension mounted. When we reached the door, I noticed Richard casting one last look in our direction. His eyes were filled with some kind of satisfaction, as if everything that had happened that evening was nothing more than a game to him. His friends, watching us, didn't bother to hide their smirks. Anger flared up inside me again, but I forced myself not to react. I was with Alice now, and the most important thing was to calm her down so she wouldn't feel even more vulnerable. We stepped outside, and the fresh air immediately hit us, but it couldn't lift the weight from my chest. Alice quickened her pace, as if trying to escape everything that had happened in the bar, but I saw how tense her body still was, as though she was reliving everything again and again. We walked in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts. When we reached the next intersection, I finally broke the silence. "Are you okay?" I asked, although I knew the answer wouldn't be easy. She didn't respond immediately. For a few seconds, she just walked beside me, and I saw her gathering her strength to reply. Finally, she sighed, "I don't know." Her voice was quiet, almost inaudible. "It's just, I didn't like how all of that felt. I didn't feel safe." Her words pierced me, and I realized how serious this was for her. It wasn't just awkward behavior from Richard, it was something much deeper. She felt humiliated, as though her personal boundaries had been violated, and I couldn't ignore that. "You shouldn't have had to go through that," I said, holding back the irritation that still bubbled inside me. "If you want, I can talk to him. We can sort this out. I'm not just going to let him get away with it." Alice stopped and turned to me. There was a mix of exhaustion and gratitude on her face. "I don't want this to turn into some kind of intervention," she said, sighing. "But I just don't understand, why do people think they can behave like that? Why do they think they can look at me like I'm an object?" I felt the pain in her voice echo in my own heart. This situation wasn't just a case of bad behavior. It was a reflection of much deeper issues many women face when confronted with unwanted attention and shameless stares. And I felt like I had to do something. "I'll be here, no matter what you decide," I said firmly. "But I won't let anyone treat you like an object." We continued walking, but now the silence between us wasn't as heavy. Alice might not have been ready to take decisive steps, but I knew we couldn't just forget what had happened. Richard and his friends might have thought their actions went unnoticed, but I was determined to make them understand, not everyone is willing to stay silent when they're disrespected. And I was ready to do whatever it took to protect Alice. In sharing her side of the story, her words coming out in an almost frantic rush. Her voice trembled at times, and there was a vulnerability about her that I hadn't expected. I could see that she was struggling to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the reality that had recently shattered her life. "I never thought Richard was capable of something like this," she confessed, her gaze dropping to the table as though the weight of her own words had become too much to bear. She explained how, for years, she had worked tirelessly to maintain the appearance of a perfect family. She had put so much of herself into their marriage, believing it was built on trust and love. To have that trust betrayed by her husband, a man she had built a life with, was unfathomable. Now, everything she had known and relied on seemed like a lie. "How could he do this to me?" she whispered, her voice cracking with raw emotion. "I thought I knew him better than anyone." I listened quietly, not sure what to say. There was something about her that made it difficult for me to feel anger. Instead, I felt a deep sense of empathy. Our pain was the same. Her world had crumbled just like mine, and while the details of our situations were different, the core of it, the betrayal, was the same. I saw her as more than just Richard's wife. She was a woman who had been betrayed and was now struggling to rebuild her life, just as I was. She paused, her eyes welling up with tears. "I don't know how to forgive him. I don't even know if I want to." The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, but I could see that it was mixed with fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of a future that seemed uncertain and cruel. It was as if she were caught between wanting to cling to the man she had loved and needing to break free from the man who had betrayed her. There was a long silence between us, and for a moment, I thought we might never find the words to bridge the distance between us, but as the minutes passed, I began to realize that this conversation, awkward and painful as it was something we both needed. We were both in this strange, dark place, trying to navigate the wreckage of our lives. We were both looking for some kind of closure, some semblance of understanding, and neither of us had the answers. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice quiet now. "Everything feels like a lie. How do you go back to something when you can't trust it anymore?" I could only nod. What could I say? How could I offer her any advice when I was just as lost as she was? Instead, I shared my own struggle. "I feel the same way. I keep wondering if things will ever go back to the way they were, but I know deep down, they won't. I think we both need time to figure this out, if we even can." Her gaze met mine then, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes. We were both victims of the same betrayal, and while the road ahead was uncertain, we were not entirely alone. It was a small comfort, but in that moment, it was all we had. We spoke for a little while longer, but the conversation began to feel like an exhausting echo of our shared pain. Eventually, we both knew it was time to leave, to return to our separate lives, though neither of us had any clear sense of where that would lead. I walked away from that cafe with no answers, but a strange sense of connection to the woman I had met. She was not the enemy. She was not even the cause of my pain. She was just another soul caught in the wreckage, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. As for Richard, I couldn't bring myself to feel anything but pity for him. In trying to preserve his own world, he had destroyed 2 others. And now, both Karen and I were left to pick up the pieces. A year had passed, and I thought that evening at the bar was just an unpleasant memory, but I was wrong. One night, as we sat at home, Alice confessed to me that she had cheated. Her words shook me to my core. We were almost on the verge of marriage, and it was at that moment she had betrayed me. When she mentioned Richard, I felt the ground slip from beneath me. It was a shock. He was the very man whose attention I had noticed so intensely. Alice told me how they stayed after the company's New Year's party, and how she followed him to his room. With every word she spoke, I felt pain and despair growing inside me. She said that in that moment, she felt special, like never before, and it made her forget all of her doubts. I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts. I remembered that night at the bar, when Richard seemed to already show clear interest in her. I recalled how his friends had laughed, discussing what had happened, and it became clear to me that it hadn't been a coincidence. It was part of some plan, and perhaps Richard had always had more serious intentions toward her than I could have imagined. I couldn't just sit and wait for the situation to resolve itself. My pride as a man had been shattered, and I knew I had to face Richard. I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to say, but I needed to look him in the eye and understand why he had done this. I found out where he worked and went there. My nerves and anger were overwhelming, but I knew that if I didn't do this, I wouldn't be able to live in peace. As soon as he stepped out of the elevator, I approached him. He immediately understood why I was there. His gaze turned cold. "What do you want?" His voice was tense. "Richard, we need to talk," I said, trying to hold my emotions in check. I didn't want this meeting to turn into a fight, but everything inside me was boiling with rage. He took a step back, his face more guarded. He clearly knew that this meeting wasn't going to end well. "I don't know what you want, but this isn't going to end well," he said, trying to keep his distance. I stepped forward, my words becoming harsher. "You ruined my life and Alice's life. You took advantage of her vulnerability, and now you need to understand that this won't be forgotten so easily." He started to justify himself, but his words sounded weak. "I didn't know it would end like this. She made the choice herself," he tried to explain. "You knew we were in a relationship, and still, you went after her. Don't try to say you didn't know," I shot back, looking him in the eye. "You could have stayed out of it, but instead, you destroyed everything." His confidence started to crack. He avoided my gaze, and I realized that he knew there was no way to justify himself. As we stood there, tense and silent, the door to the office opened, and Alice appeared in the doorway. Her gaze was full of surprise, concern, and confusion. At first, she didn't understand what was happening, but as she took in the atmosphere, it didn't take long for her to realize. She walked toward me, her eyes flicking back and forth between Richard and me, cautiously reaching out to take my hand. What's going on? Her voice was full of fear, panic creeping in. You shouldn't have come here. I felt the surge of anger in my chest begin to wane, but in its place came something worse, emptiness, a sense of hollow detachment. Alice stood there, eyes wide with sorrow, her hands trembling as if she was unsure of what to do. She wanted to comfort me, I could see that, but the weight of her actions made it impossible for either of us to bridge the growing gap between us. There were no words that could fill the void now. Alice, you don't even understand what's happened, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, the pain creeping through every syllable. You let him into our lives, and now everything is ruined. You think this is just some mistake, but it's more than that, it's a betrayal. She flinched at the word, betrayal, but still didn't pull away. Her eyes welled up with tears, and her lips trembled as she tried to form a response. Please, understand, I wasn't myself. I was confused, lost. I made a mistake, but it's not what you think. It didn't mean anything. I didn't want to hurt you. I never wanted to hurt you. The words spilled out of her in a rush, like she thought if she said them fast enough, they might erase the reality of what had happened. But nothing she said could undo the image that had been burned into my mind, the image of her and Richard, of the way he had looked at her, the way she had allowed it to happen. My chest tightened again, a new wave of pain flooding over me, and I stepped back, trying to distance myself from her words. I couldn't let myself believe her excuses anymore. You really expect me to believe that? I said, shaking my head slowly, the bitterness creeping into my voice. You didn't want to hurt me, but you let him into our home, into our lives. You let him get too close, Alice. And for what? Some fleeting moment of feeling special. Her face crumpled, her tears falling freely now as she reached out again, this time not to touch me, but just to close the space between us, as if she could somehow fill the distance that had grown between us. I never meant for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't know how to stop it once it started. I was caught up in it. And now I see what it's done. I see how much I've hurt you, and I hate myself for it. I couldn't look at her anymore. The pain of seeing her like this, knowing what she had done, was unbearable. The woman standing before me was a stranger, someone I didn't recognize. All the years we had spent together, all the trust, had been shattered in an instant. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something deep and unyielding, and the distance between us was growing wider with every second. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said, the words heavy in the air. Maybe I don't even want to. I don't know what's worse, the fact that you did it, or the fact that you don't even know why you did. Her face crumpled in anguish, and I could see her struggle with the weight of what I had just said. For a moment, I thought she might try to explain more, to fight for my forgiveness, but instead, she just stood there, silently, as if she had given up, as if she knew there was nothing left she could say to make it right. Richard, who had been standing silently off to the side, watching the entire exchange, took a step forward. This isn't helping, he said quietly, almost too calmly. His voice was cold, detached, as if he had no stake in this conversation anymore. I think it's time we all step back. I glanced at him, and for the first time, I saw the true nature of his intentions. He wasn't looking at Alice with regret or guilt, he was looking at her with indifference, like she was a passing phase in his life. A momentary distraction. It hit me all at once, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. This wasn't about her at all for him, it never had been. And for Alice, it was never as much about me as it had been about her need for validation. I turned to Alice one last time, and the words came out before I could stop them. You don't get to rewrite this. You don't get to fix this. It's over. She tried to speak again, but I couldn't hear her anymore. The weight of what had happened, the betrayal, was too heavy. I couldn't carry it anymore. The space between us, both physical and emotional, felt vast, like an abyss that had no bottom. I turned away from her and walked out, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear her calling after me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I had already made up my mind. Richard's voice followed me as I walked out the door. You're making a mistake, he said. You're overreacting. This is just a phase. But I didn't listen to him. I didn't care what he said anymore. There was no point in trying to explain, to argue, to fight anymore. It was done. I was done. As I stepped into the elevator, the doors closed behind me, and I finally allowed myself to breathe. The world outside felt different. Everything felt different, like I was stepping into a new chapter, even though I had no idea where it would lead. After I learned about what had happened between Alice and Richard, I was left in a state of complete shock and confusion. This was the most painful situation I had ever faced. But, strangely, I felt compelled to speak with Karen, the wife of Richard. Despite all the pain caused by the betrayal, she, too, found herself trapped in this labyrinth of lies and deceit. Karen called me a few days after I met with Richard and suggested we meet. I agreed, even though I had no idea what to expect from this conversation. I was still consumed by rage, and perhaps I wasn't even ready to talk, but I understood that she, too, deserved an explanation. We met in the same cafe where we had spoken before. Karen arrived in a black coat, looking as lost as I felt when we first sat across from each other. Her face was exhausted, her eyes swollen from crying, but this time there was no aggression or accusations, only weariness. She sat down at the table and began speaking without looking me in the eyes. I don't even know where to begin. Her voice was quiet and trembling. Maybe you think I didn't know anything, but that's not true. I saw that something was wrong, and I tried to understand what was happening. But you have no idea what it's like when your husband, the man you love, betrays you. When you suddenly realize that you can't trust him anymore, that everything you believed in has been destroyed. I remained silent, unsure of what to say. What can you say to a woman going through the same thing you are? We were both victims. In that moment, I realized that my grievances with her didn't matter, because she, too, was suffering. But the question remained. Why, if she felt something was wrong, didn't she do anything to stop it earlier? Karen, I began cautiously, feeling how hard it was to speak these words. You say everything is destroyed, and I can't disagree with you. But why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you break the cycle? Why did you let it all continue? Karen gritted her teeth, as if trying to hold back tears, and finally looked up at me. I tried, you understand. Her voice was a little louder now. I tried talking to him, but he always found excuses. I couldn't just walk away. I couldn't believe he was capable of this, even though everything pointed to it. Richard was my husband, and you were a friend. I couldn't even imagine that both of you would end up in such a situation. I felt a shift in my heart, a flicker of understanding for her position. Despite the fact that she wasn't responsible for what had happened, she still felt the pain, the betrayal that shattered her world just as it had shattered mine. Will you say something to me? She asked, when I remained silent for a long time. I could feel how difficult it was for me to respond, but I said, I don't know what to say to you, Karen. I feel sorry for you, just as I do for myself. But perhaps we both need to understand what happened and move forward, despite everything. Neither of us had a choice in this, and we're not to blame for having to face it. I think we'll both have to live with it. In her eyes, I saw a flicker of relief, as if it eased her to know that I wasn't blaming her. She wasn't the enemy, she was just another lost piece of this complicated and painful story. Karen looked at me and sighed. I don't know if I'll ever forgive Richard, and I don't know if I'll ever go back to him. But perhaps, you and we'll keep looking for our way, despite everything that's happened. I don't know either, I answered. But I need to find a way to move on. We sat in silence, both of us understanding that we couldn't change the past, but we had a chance to move forward, if only for ourselves. Several weeks later, I finally came to the painful realization that I couldn't continue my relationship with Alice. It wasn't a sudden decision, it was more of a slow, creeping understanding that, despite all our efforts, we could no longer be the people we once were. The damage had been done, and it was irreversible. Too much had been shattered, too many lines crossed. The trust we had built together had crumbled into nothing, and with that, the foundation of our relationship. As I sat there, trying to gather the right words, I felt a cold, distant emptiness inside me. I had spent so many days trying to rationalize, trying to forgive, but the truth was too painful to ignore. Alice, the woman I once thought I knew, had betrayed me in a way that went beyond anything I could comprehend. The betrayal wasn't just an act, it was a tear in the very fabric of everything we had shared. When I finally told Alice that we needed to break up, the look on her face was a mixture of disbelief and devastation. "You have no idea how much it hurts me," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Her face was twisted in sorrow, and I could see the way her body stiffened as if bracing for the blow. She looked like she hadn't expected this moment to come, as if somehow in her mind, everything would be fixed, and we could go back to how things were before. But it was too late. "I understand what you're going through," I replied, my voice much calmer than I felt inside. I couldn't afford to break down now, not in front of her. "But I can't be with you anymore. You betrayed me, and maybe I was wrong not to see what was happening between you and Richard. But none of that matters now, the damage is done." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and I could feel the weight of them settling into both of us. She looked at me, her eyes wide with anguish, but there was nothing more to say. It wasn't anger that kept me from changing my mind, but something deeper, something more painful. I had lost the ability to trust her, and without trust, there was nothing left to salvage. "Please, don't leave me," Alice's voice trembled with a desperation I hadn't heard before. She reached out to me, her hands shaking as if she were pleading for a lifeline, but I couldn't take her hand. It was too much. I could see the pain in her face, but I knew this was the only way forward for both of us. It wasn't that I didn't care anymore, I did, but caring had become complicated. Too much had been taken from us, and I wasn't sure either of us could find our way back. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what came next. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "But I need to move on. We both do. We can't go back to what we had, Alice. It's over. There's nothing more to fix." For a moment, Alice stood frozen, her eyes wide as if she were trying to process what I had just said. It was clear that she hadn't expected the finality in my words. She had hoped, like I had at first, that we could work through this, that time and apologies would heal the wound. But some things couldn't be fixed, and some wounds never fully heal. Tears started to well up in her eyes, but she didn't cry out. She just stood there, looking at me, as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping through her fingers. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, almost to herself, as if the words held any real meaning anymore. But I knew better. The hurt had already been done, and it couldn't be undone with a few words. "I know you didn't," I said, my voice softening slightly. "But intentions don't change the reality of what happened. We're both hurt, Alice. And as much as it pains me, I think we both need to let go and move on." Her shoulders slumped as the weight of my words settled in. There was no dramatic confrontation, no angry outbursts, just the quiet sadness of two people realizing that the relationship they once had was beyond repair. I felt an overwhelming sense of loss, not just for what we'd had, but for what we could have been. I could see the woman I once loved in her eyes, but the trust was gone, replaced by something colder, something harder. We weren't the same people anymore, and it was time to accept that. "I'll never forget the good times we had," I said, the words feeling almost hollow. "But I can't keep living in the past. I need to move forward, and so do you." She nodded slowly, her lips trembling as she wiped away a stray tear. There was no anger, no yelling. Just a quiet resignation, as though we both understood that this was the only way. And with that, we stood there in silence, the weight of the finality settling around us. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was necessary. It was time to part ways, to let go of the past and find a new path forward, even if that meant walking alone. As I left, I knew that this was the end. The chapter with Alice was over, and I had no choice but to move on. The heartache would take time to heal, but I had to believe that there was something better waiting for me on the other side. It was the only way to move forward. As time passed, strangely enough, I began to feel a faint glimmer of life outside the constant pain, but I knew deep down that things would never be the same. I tried to rebuild my life, focusing on my work and spending time with friends, but each moment seemed to remind me that the world I once knew was gone. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger inside me flared up again, and I would find myself consumed with resentment. I hated myself for letting this happen, for not noticing the signs earlier, for not protecting myself from the destruction Alice had caused. And, perhaps most of all, I hated her for the way she had betrayed me. The anger was relentless, and it became a constant companion, lingering in the background of everything I did. I would wake up in the morning and feel this knot in my stomach, knowing that everything had been broken, that I had been used in a way I couldn't ever undo. The moments when I remembered Alice's voice, her soft words and the affection she once had for me, only made the anger worse. How could I have been so blind? How could she have lied to me for so long? And how could she think she could just walk away, as though everything would be fine again? I started to realize how much her actions had shattered me, not just emotionally, but in ways I didn't fully understand. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Every gesture, every word, felt like it could be a lie. I wanted to confront her again, scream at her, tell her how much she had ruined me, how she had taken everything I had built with her and crushed it beneath her feet. But I knew I couldn't. It was too late. The damage had been done. And no amount of words would fix it. I saw how Karen, too, was trying to pick up the pieces of her own life, but, much like me, there was no real healing. We exchanged brief messages now and then, but there was nothing left to say. We were both victims of the same lie, trapped in the same broken world. Neither of us had a way out, and there was no solidarity between us. We were just two people, stumbling forward, unable to change what had happened. We had both lost. In moments when I could no longer hold the anger in, I would remember Alice's face, her voice, her promises, and I couldn't stop myself from wishing for things to be different. But I knew it was pointless. The relationship, the trust, the life we once had, everything was gone. What was left wasn't recovery. It was simply survival, trying to live in a world where everything had been shattered beyond repair. It was clear now that Alice and I could never go back to what we were. I couldn't forgive her, not yet, and maybe never. I hated her, and the anger gnawed at me, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. She had taken my heart and thrown it away, and now I was left picking up the pieces, angry at her for everything she had done, and angry at myself for allowing it to happen. This wasn't healing. It was just the continuation of life in a broken world, one where things could never be as they were before. As time passed, strangely enough, I began to feel a faint glimmer of life outside the constant pain, but I knew deep down that things would never be the same. I tried to rebuild my life, focusing on my work and spending time with friends, but each moment seemed to remind me that the world I once knew was gone. It wasn't easy. There were days when the anger inside me flared up again, and I would find myself consumed with resentment. I hated myself for letting this happen, for not noticing the signs earlier, for not protecting myself from the destruction Alice had caused. And, perhaps most of all, I hated her for the way she had betrayed me. The anger was relentless, and it became a constant companion, lingering in the background of everything I did. I would wake up in the morning and feel this knot in my stomach, knowing that everything had been broken, that I had been used in a way I couldn't ever undo. The moments when I remembered Alice's voice, her soft words and the affection she once had for me, only made the anger worse. How could I have been so blind? How could she have lied to me for so long? And how could she think she could just walk away, as though everything would be fine again? I started to realize how much her actions had shattered me, not just emotionally, but in ways I didn't fully understand. I couldn't trust anyone anymore. Every gesture, every word, felt like it could be a lie. I wanted to confront her again, scream at her, tell her how much she had ruined me, how she had taken everything I had built with her and crushed it beneath her feet. But I knew I couldn't. It was too late. The damage had been done. And no amount of words would fix it. I saw how Karen, too, was trying to pick up the pieces of her own life, but, much like me, there was no real healing. We exchanged brief messages now and then, but there was nothing left to say. We were both victims of the same lie, trapped in the same broken world. Neither of us had a way out, and there was no solidarity between us. We were just two people, stumbling forward, unable to change what had happened. We had both lost. In moments when I could no longer hold the anger in, I would remember Alice's face, her voice, her promises, and I couldn't stop myself from wishing for things to be different. But I knew it was pointless. The relationship, the trust, the life we once had, everything was gone. What was left wasn't recovery. It was simply survival, trying to live in a world where everything had been shattered beyond repair. It was clear now that Alice and I could never go back to what we were. I couldn't forgive her, not yet, and maybe never. I hated her, and the anger gnawed at me, leaving me feeling more alone than ever. She had taken my heart and thrown it away, and now I was left picking up the pieces, angry at her for everything she had done, and angry at myself for allowing it to happen. This wasn't healing, it was just the continuation of life in a broken world, one where things could never be as they were before. Several months had passed since Alice and I broke up. I was trying to move on, though at times it all came back, like a boomerang. Richard, who had destroyed not only my life but also his own family, was still somewhere in my memory. It was hard to forget how he had literally torn us apart. Alice and I no longer communicated, but we occasionally thought about each other, each of us processing the breakup in our own way. Then, one day, Karen, Richard's wife, called me. She asked to meet and talk. I wasn't entirely sure about the conversation, but at some point, I decided that I needed to do it, if only to understand her position. I knew she was going through what I had, but from the other side, she was a part of this tragedy, and she couldn't possibly ignore that her husband had also destroyed her life. At the appointed time, I arrived at the cafe. Karen was already there. She looked like someone who had been through a lot, but in her eyes, there was not only pain but also a kind of desperation that I could understand. When I sat down across from her, she immediately started talking, without any preamble. "Do you think it doesn't hurt me?" Her voice was tense, and she looked me in the eyes as if she wanted to squeeze out everything that lay hidden behind this moment. "I know everything, about how Richard treated you, about how he destroyed your life. But who's going to tell me he didn't destroy mine too?" I felt her words wound me. I didn't expect this kind of response. I thought she would be looking for excuses, trying to understand how it all happened, but no, she was angry. And at some point, I realized she hated Alice more than even me. I lived with him all these years, and now I understand that he's been lying to me this whole time. All these meetings, those late calls. I thought he was working late, but he was with her, with you. And I didn't even notice. How could I not have noticed? Her words came out as if she had finally come to terms with her role in this tragedy. I didn't know what to say. Anything I could have said felt empty. Yes, Richard was guilty, but I was also guilty for letting him interfere in our lives, and even more, I was guilty of being blind to the signs. But I knew that all I could do now was listen, because, like me, she had lost too much. "You don't want to understand what happened, do you?" Karen was irritated. She leaned back in her chair, gripping her coffee cup as if trying to calm her nerves. "You think I don't understand what you're going through? You probably think all of this is my fault, that he was only your husband, that I was just background. But you don't even know how many nights I sat at home hoping he'd come back, that things would go back to how they were. And now I see that he's been lying to me my whole life. I don't think you'll ever understand how much that hurts." I stayed silent, trying to process what she was saying. Karen wasn't looking for sympathy. She wasn't apologizing for any pain she may have caused me. On the contrary, she was trying to pour out her anger because I was part of this tragedy. Anger at Alice, anger at Richard, anger at the world. When Alice walked into the cafe, Karen didn't even try to hide her disdain. Alice approached our table, and she could clearly feel the tension in the air. She probably knew this meeting wouldn't bring anything good. "Alice," Karen looked at her, her eyes cold and full of rage. "You think it's that easy for you? You destroyed my life. You think you can just leave it all behind, and I'll sit quietly by, watching as you leave your marks and move on." Alice, just like me, could feel that this conversation wouldn't be peaceful. She sat down, unsure of how to react. She tried to stay calm, but I could see the mix of sadness and anger in her eyes. I knew she was struggling too, just like I had, and perhaps she found it hard to hold back tears in front of Karen. "Alice," Karen continued, her voice cutting through the silence, do you think I believe you? You didn't just ruin me, you ruined my whole family. He cheated on me, but you didn't stop it, you used him, like a toy. And now you're telling me you regret it? Do you even believe that yourself? Alice remained silent, not knowing how to respond. The silence that hung in the air was so heavy, it felt unbearable. At some point, I realized this wasn't a meeting for understanding or forgiveness. This was a meeting for Karen to unload all the pain, all the rage she had been carrying. But neither of us could change what had happened. Karen left, not saying another word. Alice stayed at the table, consumed by her own world of grief. I felt that perhaps this was the last moment we could have changed anything, but now it seemed like everything was already too late. Alice called me. Time had passed, but the thought that everything had been destroyed still haunted me. I had already grown accustomed to the solitude, to the silence in the house, to my new life without her. We hadn't communicated, and that felt right. I had chosen this path, and it seemed like Alice had accepted it too, though there was something in her behavior that made me question whether she truly had. The phone call was unexpected. When I saw her name on the screen, I froze for a moment. Mentally, I tried to guess what she might want to say. Perhaps it was the moment she realized that no matter how much she wished for it, some mistakes can't be undone, and now she needed to justify everything that had happened. I hesitated to answer. I knew that this call could change everything, and at that moment, I wasn't ready to dive back into that chaos. I picked up the phone, trying not to show how fast my heart was beating from the tension. Her voice was soft, but I could hear the uncertainty, the desperation in it. She asked if we could talk. I remember how she started by admitting her mistake. Her words were full of regret, but there was something in them that didn't feel genuine. She was trying to convince me she had changed, but I could tell the difference between her words and her actions. They said entirely different things. She told me she wanted to go back, to start everything over. But I couldn't understand what she really meant. Did she want me back out of guilt, or was there something deeper? But by that point, I already knew the answer. Everything that had happened between us couldn't be undone. I could hear that in her voice. There was no real remorse. It felt more like a desire to reclaim the familiar, rather than a sincere wish to make amends for her mistakes. I tried to stay calm, though inside, I was boiling with emotion. I listened to her until she finished, but I was already prepared for what I was going to say. My voice was quiet, controlled, but firm. I didn't have the energy to search for the truth in her words, because I knew too much had already been broken. We were no longer the people we once were. Alice, I said slowly, carefully choosing each word, you say you want to make everything right again, but you can't just undo what's been done. We've been through too much, and it's clear that there's too much pain and too many lies between us. You're asking me to trust you again, but how can I? How can you expect me to forget what happened? Her silence stretched on the other end of the line. I could almost feel her disappointment, but it didn't move me. I had made peace with the fact that we had both crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by someone who had betrayed not only me but herself too. She spoke again, but this time her voice cracked slightly. I don't expect you to forget. I just want a chance to fix things, even if it's impossible. I know I hurt you, and I know I can't undo it, but maybe we could start over. Her words felt empty, like echoes of a past I had already buried. I wanted to believe in the possibility of healing, but I knew better now. Healing takes time, and sometimes, it takes letting go. I don't think starting over is possible, I replied, my voice unwavering. It's not about forgetting the past, Alice. It's about understanding that we can't go back to what we were. You've already hurt me more than I thought I could bear, and I don't think we can fix what's been broken, no matter how hard we try. She was quiet again, and I could feel her struggle to find the right words. The desperation in her voice was evident, but I knew it was too late for both of us. We had run out of chances. We had both made choices that led us here, and now, there was nothing left to salvage. I never wanted to hurt you, she finally said, her voice soft, regretful. But I did, and I can't take it back. I just want you to know that I'm sorry, and I'll always regret what happened. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I know you're sorry, Alice. But sorry doesn't fix anything. It doesn't bring back what we had. And I think it's time for both of us to move on. There was a long pause before she spoke again, and when she did, I could hear the tears in her voice. I understand, she whispered. I just wanted to try, one last time. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of her words, but I knew it was the right decision. I know you did, I said quietly. But it's over now, we can't keep holding on to something that's already fallen apart. And with that, I hung up the phone. I sat there for a long while, the silence pressing down on me. I had made my peace with it, there was no turning back now. After everything that had happened, Alice seemed completely drained. The breakup with her husband, her attempts to repair their relationship, which had hit an insurmountable wall, left her in an emotional crisis. All that remained in her life was emptiness, and despite trying various ways to fill it, the only person she still felt any connection to was Richard. She convinced herself that everything between them didn't have to be a mistake, that there could have been something more. Deciding that he was her only hope for recovery, she dialed his number. Her heart pounded in her chest, and when the phone finally picked up, she felt her nerves tighten into a knot. Her voice trembled as she began to speak. She could barely believe the words coming out of her mouth, but in her eyes burned the fire of hope. Richard, I want to start over. Everything that happened was a mistake, I know. But I feel like if we both try, we can leave it all behind. Her words were weak, but there was desperate determination in them. She wanted to believe that it could be fixed. She hoped that he would hear her, see her pain, and maybe, just maybe, give her back what she had been desperately trying to restore. Richard, standing in his apartment, listened to her words, his face remaining utterly neutral. He was neither surprised by her request nor interested in what she was saying. He had been one of the people who had once shattered her world, and now her words seemed to him nothing more than the echo of a broken story he had long since closed. He knew Alice had been through a lot, but his feelings for her had long disappeared. His interest was superficial, and he couldn't understand why she was still hoping for something between them. Alice, his voice sounded cold, emotionless, almost distant. You want to turn everything back, but I don't think it's a good idea. We both know what happened between us, and I'm not sure it's worth going back to that. She likely didn't expect such a response. He could feel her words trembling, her attempt to find strength to continue the conversation, hoping he might change his mind. But for Richard, it was already decided. He understood that everything that had happened between them had left too much pain and disappointment. He didn't want to go back to it. You know what happened between us, Alice, he continued. I don't want to relive all of that. What happened was a mistake. We both made mistakes, but I don't think it's worth trying to fix them. Alice fell silent. She couldn't find the words. She heard his voice remain unyielding, and she understood that her hopes were crumbling right before her eyes. She didn't feel anger, but rather helplessness and pain. Richard was speaking the truth, but her heart refused to accept it. You deserve more than what I can offer you, Richard said, his words coming out like a sentence. He knew that all he could offer was emptiness, and Alice didn't deserve that. He didn't want to deceive her or give her false hope. Listening to him, Alice felt all her hope slip away into nothingness. Richard had said everything that needed to be said, and her attempt to find new meaning in him seemed futile. His words were not an insult, rather, they were a simple statement of the fact that there could be nothing between them anymore. It wasn't punishment for her, it was the end of a story that had long since needed to be closed. Okay, she whispered softly. Those words sounded like an admission of defeat, a surrender. She couldn't say anything more. After that, Richard felt a strange lightness. He understood that Alice might suffer, but it no longer mattered. He had freed himself from her expectations, and the feeling of liberation filled his soul with peace. He didn't know what would happen to Alice, but he no longer felt responsible for her feelings. He let her go, and that feeling of lightness was almost pleasant. When the conversation ended, he hung up the phone, and Alice was left standing on the other end of the line. She was completely drained, and the silence that settled in her apartment seemed deafening and unbearable. She felt her hopes collapse, and now she was alone in her disappointment. Quietly, without tears, she stepped away from the phone and didn't know what to do next. For Richard, this conversation was the final point. Everything that had happened between them, her love, her suffering, was no longer his problem. He had long since realized that everything with Alice was over, and now, with this last call, he had completely closed that chapter of his life. Alice was left alone in the empty apartment, where her husband had once been, where Richard had once been. She realized that, in addition to her own life, she had ruined the lives of 3 others.